Hola amigos, bienvenidos a esta última convocatoria de conferencias internacionales 2021 de la Asociación ELA Argentina para toda la comunidad ELA de habla hispana. En este caso nos encontramos con el doctor Paul Mehta, que es el director ejecutivo del Registro Nacional de ELA de los Estados Unidos, un organismo rector a nivel mundial en cuanto a datos epidemiológicos y detalles que hacen a la ELA y que permiten también a los investigadores tomar decisiones para sus ensayos clínicos. Paul Mehta estuvo en la Argentina, invitado por la asociación hace unos años atrás, donde entablamos una hermosa amistad que nos permitió vernos en diferentes lugares del mundo, en simposios mundiales de investigación, y poder así cultivar una relación que nos permite que Paul esté aquí con nosotros y nos comparta la actualidad de los datos de investigación de ELA en los Estados Unidos que se traspolan a gran parte del mundo. Bienvenido, Paul, a este nuevo espacio que te brinda la asociación y, como siempre, un placer recibirte y estar en contacto con vos.
Thank you. My name is Paul Mehta. I'm with the National ALS Registry, and I want to thank the Argentine ALS Association, especially Pablo and Dario, for the invitation to speak at your event and answer any questions you may have. It's a pleasure knowing Pablo and Dario from many years ago. They gave us an invitation to come to Argentina to present on the National ALS Registry. And so we certainly enjoy the actual visit to Argentina, as well as talking about the National ALS Registry. Before I get started, I just want to let you know I'm a big supporter of the Argentine Football Association, the Albiceleste, and also a big fan of Diego Maradona. So may he rest in peace. But let me go ahead and get started. So very good. So this talk will be about the National ALS Registry and our multifaceted research platform. I have no disclosures. So very quick outline of the presentation. I'll be talking about the background of the registry, our methodology, and we do a lot more than just count ALS cases. The federal research initiatives that you may not be aware of, the prevalence of ALS in the United States, the registry surveys we have, the National ALS Biorepository, our clinical notification mechanism where we connect patients with clinical trials and epidemiological studies, as well as the research publications and as well as the research that we fund through the registry. So very quickly, just want to go over the ALS Act. So back in 2008, Congress signed the US ALS Registry Act, and that actually allowed CDC to go ahead and have their own registry for ALS. This was done by a considerable push, as well as for ALS patients in the United States to have their own registry to go ahead and find out the number of cases of ALS in the US and so forth. So what the registry does is we look at the epidemiology of ALS, the incidence, prevalence, mortality of ALS in the US, describe the demographics of disease, that is who gets ALS in the US, as well as more importantly, looking at the risk factors and etiologies of ALS, what causes ALS. In the US, it did not make ALS reportable. So what that means is, my next slide will talk about that. So in many countries, such as in Europe, you can actually, ALS is reportable, or there's a way to go ahead and capture the number of cases, for example, in a single payer healthcare system in Europe, where you can actually see and count the number of cases. In the US, our system is fragmented. That is, we have a lot of people who can get care from different sorts of areas, whether it's private insurance through Medicare, the VA system, which is the Veterans Administration, the individuals who actually have served in the military and they get their care through the VA system. So in the US, we call this reportable versus notifiable. In the US, reportable diseases are mandatory. So that is, they're reported to healthcare districts, communities, providers, and so forth. And typically what happens is a lot of these diseases tend to be communicable diseases, that is, pass from one person to another. So for example, tuberculosis, COVID-19, these are considered communicable and reportable to state health departments, who in turn will go ahead and report it to CDC. And the only state in the US where ALS is reportable is the state of Massachusetts. But Massachusetts does not at this time report to CDC their number of cases. So that becomes a bit problematic and cumbersome to figure out exactly who has ALS. And so what we did, we actually went ahead and developed novel case finding methods to determine the number of cases in the US. And so what we do is we look at the, our methodology is based on doing case ascertainment from the national databases. And these are, for example, CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, as well as the VA system, which I just mentioned, as well as the online web portal. So patients come to our website, answer a series of questions, and depending on how they answer, they'll go ahead and be added to the registry. And during this process, they can go ahead and consent to receive information about clinical trials, as well as the National ALS Biorepository that I'll be talking about shortly, as well as answering a whole bunch of risk factor surveys, which I'll be showing to you momentarily as well. So patients, when they register on our system at cdc.gov/ALS, they're able to go ahead, like we say, join the fight against ALS and be part of the registry and take risk factor surveys, get information about clinical trials, as well as the National ALS Biorepository. So we like to say the registry does a lot more than just count ALS cases. We have the National ALS Biorepository, which is which I'll talk about momentarily, which actually is there for patients to join, and it's a completely free service for patients. We go to the patient's homes to go ahead and collect their saliva as well as their blood. And then we have a postmortem component as well. And so to date, we actually have almost 1,500 patients who are in the National ALS Biorepository. I mentioned earlier, we do the epidemiology of ALS in the US, looking at the incidence, prevalence, mortality of ALS, work with partner organizations, both domestically as well as internationally. So we work with the ALS Association in the US, MDA, which is the Muscular Dystrophy Association, as well as a group out of Chicago called the Les Turner ALS Foundation. Like I mentioned, we also work with partners such as the Argentine ALS Association as well, and have done so for a while, talking to Pablo and Dario, how we can help them and give them information about what we do here in the US. We collect risk factor survey data, which I'll mention momentarily. We have the notification mechanism where we actually, like I said, connect patients with clinical trials and epidemiological studies. A number of these trials are ones you've already heard of, which are very, very, how would you say, high profile trials in the US. And we also fund research. We fund research to look at the etiology and the risk factors of ALS, which is very, very important. So just to quickly mention some of the federal ALS research initiatives. One may not know that the federal government does a lot of research in the area of ALS, but not all the research is the same. So at the NIH, they do a lot of basic sciences. They do, for example, looking at the genetics of ALS, looking at biomarkers and so forth, kind of like the basic sciences of ALS research. DoD, Department of Defense, CDRMP, which stands for Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, looks at preclinical development of therapeutic agents and so forth. So these are steps required before FDA approval. So they're looking at the preclinical development of possible ALS drugs, toxicology, stability, pharmacokinetics, and so forth. Here at CDC, ATSDR, what we do is we look at the who, what, and when of ALS. Who gets ALS? When do they get ALS? And more importantly, why do they get ALS? And so we do that by looking at the risk factors, identifying risk factors and etiologies. So possible causes of ALS, such as, let's say, heavy metals, pesticides, cyanobacteria. So for us, it's very important to figure out, what causes ALS and potential risk factors and how they impact public health. So just very quickly, the prevalence of ALS in the US, this is for 2016, is a little bit over 16,000 cases, which equates to 5.2 of every 100,000 adults in the US have ALS. This is very comparable to the 2015 report, which also had pretty much the same prevalence of 5.2 per 100,000. So what this says is ALS is more common in whites, males, and persons between the ages of 60 and 69 in the US. Our findings are also consistent with other findings across other countries as well, where they also show ALS more common in whites and males, as well as persons, past the age of 60 as well. So our findings are actually aligned with other findings and other registries across the world as well. So these are the risk factor surveys I talked about. So currently, when a patient comes to the registry, cdc.gov/ALS, and they sign up, they can take a number of risk factor surveys. We currently have 18 risk factor surveys, and these surveys are looking at demographics. Where did you work? Were you in the military? Did you smoke? Did you drink? Physical activity, family history of neurological diseases. We also have ALS-FRS, which is a longitudinal survey where patients take it more than once, which kind of looks at the disease progression of ALS. We also look at where did you live, lifetime occupational history, possible exposures to pesticides, caffeine consumption, hobbies, and specific toxin exposures, as well as head and neck TBI injuries, as well as a sports survey, which looks at the sports you've played, whether in high school, collegiate, or professionally as well. And so we also, like I said, this is a very, very rich database right here. We almost have close to 100,000 completed surveys so far. And these surveys, like I mentioned, I mean, this is certainly where patients tell us their story about their disease. And like I mentioned, why take the risk factor surveys? For us as researchers, it's very important for us to know if certain occupations are at high risk for ALS. Military service. So we know in the US, veterans are at a greater risk of getting ALS. Actually, people who've served in the military are actually double the risk of getting ALS than those who've not served in the military. Smoking, physical activity, those are also risk factors for ALS. For example, where did you live? Were you exposed to certain pesticides? That's very, very important as well. Traumatic brain injuries, TBI, those are also concussions. Those are also areas we want to look at as well. We also have one survey, which is an open-ended survey, which allows patients to tell us their story, what they may think it may have caused their disease. So it allows them to qualitatively enter into our system what they feel may have caused their disease. And so these surveys, like I mentioned, are 18. Patients can take them in any order they wish. And bottom line, this helps us help scientists solve the mysteries behind ALS, like I mentioned, the risk factors and possible causes. National ALS Biorepository, I mentioned very quickly in my earlier, when I started, is a part of the National ALS Registry. And this biorepository is a unique system. Like I mentioned before, we go to the patient's homes for free to go ahead and collect their saliva as well as their blood. All their samples are actually genotyped, and a number of them are also, we send them for whole genome sequencing as well. We also link all the risk factor survey data I just showed to you in the previous slide with the patient biosample. So we have the patient's sex, their age, where do they work, where do they live, and all that information is very, very rich. And we also go nationally. So we go from pretty much from coast to coast in the US to go ahead and get the patients for the biorepository. This biorepository, like I mentioned, is both pre as well as post-mortem samples. There is no charge for the patients to go ahead and use this service. We also recently collaborated with Johns Hopkins University to expand research in the area of biomarkers, genetics, and so forth. And this partnership with Johns Hopkins will allow the National ALS Biorepository as well as the Johns Hopkins Tissue Core to go ahead and work with researchers and give them the samples they need to go ahead and work for the research projects they have. So this is a quick schematic of the biorepository itself, where you have the in-home collections, the blood, the saliva, the urine, as well as the postmortem collections, the bone, brain, spinal cord. We currently have, in the next slide, 50 individuals who are in the postmortem collection. These specimens, the risk factor surveys I mentioned earlier are matched with the patients themselves, and this is done all anonymously as well. Patients can also do their GUID, Global Unique Identifier, as well, and go ahead and have that generated. And that helps researchers to kind of look at patients through various studies which they may be a part of. And then all these specimens are sent to researchers to have them work on different areas, like I mentioned, whether it's genetics, biomarkers, and so forth. So this is a quick schematic of the number of samples we currently have in the biorepository. So we have DNA, RNA, plasma, serum, and so forth, as well as the postmortem samples, brain, spinal cord, CSF, and so forth. And like I said, I mean, we have close to 1,500 patients between the two in the National ALS Biorepository. These are some of the studies that are currently using these samples from the biorepository. We have the University of Pittsburgh looking at extracellular innate, for example, in motor neuron 47. We also have certain, for example, longevity as well as Curalis, who are actually drug companies or pharmaceutical companies in the private sector looking at different areas as well. For example, longevity is looking at immunomodulators. We also internally look at areas such as heavy metals and so forth. Columbia University is looking at novel extracellular vesicle proteins and so forth, which are shed from the body. So these are all very, very important research topics that we do, and we go ahead and support these researchers in academia as well as private industry as well. This is more continuing on of other groups who are actually getting samples as well. Like I mentioned earlier, we do our own internal metal analysis through CDC's own laboratories, looking at metals in whole blood and so forth, as well as urine. We work with the National Institute of Health to go ahead and look at genomic analysis, so both genotyping as well as whole genome sequencing as well. We also look at different areas. For example, Dartmouth College is looking at ALS risk exposures and so forth, the effects on unfolded protein response pathways. University of Pittsburgh is looking at the something called persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, and how they go ahead and these particular they're called forever chemicals, these persistent organic pollutants. And so how do these particular chemicals impact the body, and are they a risk factor for ALS and so forth? So this is just a number. We have over a dozen studies that we've currently helped to recruit for in these areas with the National ALS Biorepository. Not recruit for, I'm sorry, provide samples for. So just jumping to a different topic, our research notification system. This is a system that we developed, which, like I said earlier, allows patients to get information about clinical trials and epidemiological studies in the comfort of their own home. So pretty much, I'd say twice a month, if not more, we will send them information about clinical trials. And over actually 60 institutions have actually used this particular system, both domestic and internationally, for their recruitment purposes. And what it allows for researchers to go ahead and submit to us their application. Their CDC IRB approval is not needed. The only IRB approval is needed is coming from the institution itself. And researchers could search or ask us to search for criteria based on age, sex, time since diagnosis, as well as if they want to do a particular part of the US for their clinical trial or study. And so it's a very, very helpful system, and the approval process is typically less than 4 weeks for us to review and grant approval. This is some of the highlighted notifications we've actually helped to support and recruit. So Brainstorm was a clinical trial that was looking at repeated dosing of neurone, which are mesenchymal stem cells from the patient's own blood marrow. The enrollment's been completed. The trial was not as successful as one would like, but I believe the company's looking at different ways to potentially work with the actual trial information they have and so forth. Orphazyme is the other one. Orion Pharmaceuticals is the other one as well. Amylyx Pharmaceuticals has certainly been in the news. We helped to recruit for Amylyx Pharmaceuticals. That was led by Dr. Sabrina Paganoni. And AMX 0035 is hopefully may get approved by the FDA shortly for ALS patients. And so this certainly is a very exciting drug. Cytokinetics, we've helped to recruit for their studies as well. And so, like I said, I mean, this system is a very, very unique system, which we currently, if we press the button, goes to over 10,000 patients. We'll get information about these clinical trials. These are some of the more notifications we have. So we're actually recruiting for Mitsubishi Tanabe is oral edaravone formulation. That's so currently edaravone is administered through a port. So it's intravenously, but this oral formulation would be obviously in most likely a pill form, and so it would be a much more easier way to take this particular medication. So we also help recruit for epidemiological studies. So, for example, the ALS Association's Focus Survey, which is led by the association itself, which evaluates patient and caregiver burden. We also have recruited for Columbia University, Dr. Hiroshi Mitsumoto, looking at the relationship between oxidative stress and ALS, as well as for University of Rochester, which was analyzing the quality of life in ALS patients and so forth and caregivers. These are some upcoming trials, the Healy platform trial, which is ongoing. And so this particular platform trial will be used in the registry for their future trials as well. Right now, I believe the trial is kind of only relegated to certain areas and certain parts of the country, but we're certainly looking forward to recruiting for the Healy platform trial, as well as the NIH's HERV-K suppression therapy, antiretroviral therapy. We're looking forward to working with the NIH on that particular trial as well. So the impact of our notification system, like I mentioned, we hope to work with over a dozen companies, pharmaceutical companies, for their clinical trials. Their approvals are very, very quick, within a month. It's a free service for academia and companies. There's no charge for this. And we feel we've actually probably recruited over 3,000 patients for this particular system we have. And this is the largest population of ALS patients in the US, which are in the registry. And the system certainly, I think, is one of those areas which has been used effectively by both industry as well as academia. So some of the research publications we are doing, we have done. We have over 75 peer-reviewed publications, and these are found on our website, cdc.gov/ALS, and you can read about the various publications. We also present at various conferences, AAN, NEALS, International ALS MND Symposium. A current manuscript we currently have, which is with a journal for publication, is the impact of our notification system, in which I just gave you a quick description on how that's impacted and helped out patients for their clinical trial, getting into a clinical trial, as well as academia and pharmaceutical companies. And the co-authors are Dr. James Berry, Sabrina Paganoni, Rick Bedlack, and Hiroshi Matsumoto. We've helped to, like I said, helps to recruit for their own studies and so forth. We estimate we've actually helped to recruit, like I mentioned, thousands of individuals for this particular way we have this system for clinical trials and studies. And so it's a very, very effective way to get information about clinical trials to patients. So other publications for this past year, and these are all available on our website. Risk factors for ALS. We did a regional US case control study, which looked at, for example, electrical burns and hobbies, and which found an increased risk of ALS among those who were actually working, who had electrical burns and hobbies. We also did a case control study looking at agriculture chemicals and the potential risk factors. And that was done through Columbia University, and that found increased risk, increased ALS with occupational exposure to lead, as well as exposure to agriculture chemicals. So we also have other publications here, and these are, like I said, all found on our website, where we looked at the reproductive history and age of onset for women diagnosed with ALS. And what we found were women who reported completing menopause before the age of 50 were significantly more likely to be diagnosed with ALS before age 60 when compared to those reporting entering menopause after age 50. So this is almost kind of like the factor where you have estrogen potentially playing a protective factor in women. We also had a publication looking at the history of vigorous leisure time physical activity and early onset. And what this found was patients with ALS who had a history of vigorous physical activity, VPA, before the age of 35 were significantly more likely to be diagnosed with ALS before age 60. So this certainly is very, very interesting findings we have here. So switching topics, registry funds research. So we feel funding research is extremely important to figure out what causes ALS and the risk factors behind ALS. To date, we have 21 funded institutions, and these institutions, every year we go ahead and have a research cycle, a funding cycle, and we ask for applications to fund more research in the upcoming year. And these are currently, we have, like I said, over 21 funded institutions, and we just recently funded the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, and they're looking at to identify and evaluate risk factors for ALS. As well as University of Michigan linking long-term air pollution exposure with inflammation and ALS. And so we funded Harvard looking at pre-disease biomarkers of persistent organic pollutants, as well as serological profiling of the human virome and ALS risk in a military population. So these are just some of the studies that we actually helped to fund. We would certainly welcome you to come to our website and go ahead and look at all other studies we've actually funded as well. These are some additional studies that we funded. One of them was looking at metabolomics signatures through the University of Michigan, and they were looking at these signatures in persistent organic pollutants. Let's see, we also have one right here, which I will talk about. This is the ALS risk in the Latin American population. So this was a population-based case control comparative study with 3 European population-based cohorts. And the significance of this particular study is, they wanted to find out why the Hispanic population in South America has lower rates of ALS when compared to the Europeans. And this is led by Dr. Orla Hardiman of Trinity College in Dublin. And the countries of Cuba, Uruguay, and Chile were the ones who are currently part of this LANOS, as it's called, Latin American Epidemiological Network of ALS, LANOS. And I certainly would encourage you, if you haven't done so already, I believe Pablo mentioned to me before my talk, you've already spoken with Dr. Hardiman about potentially joining this group, which I certainly would encourage you to do that. This right here is the LANOS team from our last visit. We were in Uruguay 2-3 years ago, and this is just the team members right here. I'm sorry, not in Uruguay. This is actually in Dublin. My apologies. And this is the team members who came in from Cuba as well as from Chile to go ahead and have a discussion and a multi-day discussion about the research. And for fiscal year 22, our fiscal year in the U.S. government begins on October 1, so it just started just a few weeks ago. We are also going to be having a new funding opportunity announcement, and I would certainly encourage any sort of academic partners in Buenos Aires or any part of Argentina to go ahead and apply for these particular grants. They are available for international researchers, and like I just mentioned, the Karolinska Institute just went ahead, was awarded. So you could certainly, like I said, apply for this particular grant, or even work with a different institution in the US or even in Europe to go ahead and apply for these particular grants. So in closing, the impact of the National ALS Registry is we want to have a better understanding of, like I mentioned, the who, what, and when, where of ALS, the epidemiology, the prevalence, mortality, incidence of ALS. We want to figure out who gets ALS. We want to figure out why they get ALS, the risk factors of ALS. And like I said, our goal is to figure out what causes ALS. If we can figure out what causes ALS, we could potentially prevent ALS down the road. That's very, very important. We fund research looking at various different areas. And more importantly, we also work with partners, whether it's the ALS Association in the US or the ALS Association in Argentina. We want to go ahead and work with partners across the globe to go ahead and raise the awareness of ALS, as well as opportunities to participate in research. So great, thank you. I will take your questions.
Okay, so thank you for that. That was excellent, and we already have the whole presentation that you sent to me. So I had a couple of questions here.
Sure.
Very specific. So okay, we saw some figures in your slides about the 2016 figures in the US, over 16,000 people with ALS, more prevalent in males, more prevalent in whites. Age, it's about, in average, is about between 60 to 69.
Correct.
Can you add some data, specific data in terms of, for example, progression rates, type of onset, and genes?
So that information I don't have that readily available, because we've actually have published on progression and so forth, and we published on our clinical onset survey, which looked at limb versus sporadic and so forth. And that paper is actually published online. I can send it to you afterwards, Pablo. And this way you can actually go ahead and look it over. But we've done progression. And like I said, it looked at males and females at certain ages to see exactly what sort of progression did they have, and onset as well, whether it was limb or whether it was bulbar onset and so forth. So that information we have. Regarding the actual, your other question was, I'm sorry, what was it again? It was the...
well, progression rates, type of onset, and genes. What about genes?
Got it. Very good. So we have actually genotyped close to 1,000 patients so far from the National ALS Biorepository, and that data will be published. But pretty much what we're seeing is we're also seeing the same proportion of patients, about 10% of our own patients who actually have those ALS genes. So whether it's SOD1 or C9 or 72, in our cohort of patients, we're seeing the same proportion of genes, 10% with C9 and SOD1 being the most common genes.
Yeah, that's what we expected. Yeah,
Mhm.
SOD1 and C9. You also show a slide about a risk factor survey that you guys conducted in CDC. Can you tell me anything about the results of environmental risk factors? What seems to be more risky for the development of ALS?
So those risk factor surveys, we've actually published data, for example, on whether smoking or physical activity and menopause, are actual risk factors for ALS. And I mentioned that during my talk exactly what those were. But those 18 risk factor surveys, as well as the areas that we fund, all the research that we're funding, those are the areas that we're looking to go ahead and look at potential risk factors for ALS. So for example, one risk factor is cyanobacteria, which is sometimes in the news, harmful algal blooms you may see in freshwater bodies, and potential exposure to that is actually appears to be a potential risk factor. As well as a risk factor is certain metals. Lead is also a particular metal which appears to be a risk factor for ALS. There are also other areas, for example, persistent organic pollutants or POPs, benzene, so forth. These are forever chemicals that are used to go ahead, which are used by industry for farming and so forth, pest control. Those also potentially appear to be a risk factor for ALS as well. So what we do here at CDC is we go ahead and build a body of science by funding research to look at exactly what these particular risk factors are. Obviously there's something called causation and association. And so we want to make sure that, we have the data, we have the results to say, hey, this particular variable appears to have a much more stronger association with ALS. And hopefully we can get to the point where we say, this particular, whatever it is, a chemical or a metal, appears to be, has causative properties for ALS. And that's where we want to get down to. And so by those 18 risk factor surveys we have, that helps us, our internally scientists as well as those risk factor survey data are also available for researchers as well to go ahead and request and go ahead and do their own analyses as well. So those surveys, as well as the research we fund, is how we go ahead and figure out exactly what causes ALS and the potential risk factors for ALS.
Great, thanks. I was going to ask you to, besides the LAENIALS, Latin American Scientific Group, did any country in Latin America reach out to you to get some help to conduct a local registry in their countries?
So we went to Argentina, obviously, many years ago, and you guys talked about your own registry you have, which is a very, I believe, a comprehensive registry, and your ascertainment, the cases you're able to identify was very robust, which was great. We have not reached out to, or other countries have not reached out to us recently. We went to Ecuador many years ago to present on the registry and what we do, but it wasn't about us providing the country any assistance about helping them set up a registry. But for us, I mean, it's important for us to go ahead and communicate with whether it's countries in South America, Europe, or wherever, to let them know what we do here, and if these best practices could be translated in their own country as well. Obviously, the Europeans have their own registers, as they're called, in many countries, whether it's the UK or Ireland or Italy. They have very robust systems of capturing ALS cases through their healthcare network. And from there, they can go ahead and look at their data and so forth and exposures. But to date, right now, we are happy to provide information, provide like I said, technical assistance when it comes to what we do here in the U.S. But as of date, the only country that we've actually worked with is only Argentina. And like I said, our visit to your country many years ago was a very a great example of you guys capturing the cases, in your country and using them and helping out the patients, which is very important. So,
great. I have two questions related to COVID. The first is, how did the burden of COVID influence on your work with the ALS National Registry? And the second question is, if you are planning to follow up on possible effects of COVID in ALS patients, or possible effects of COVID in developing ALS in the future, or neurological disorders in the future, which we heard of from some scientists around the world?
Those are great questions. So COVID really impacted the registry. We had to suspend our biorepository collections because the collections themselves we go to the patient's homes to go ahead and get their blood and urine, and we did not want to expose them to any sort of potential, from our phlebotomists who go there to go ahead and collect their blood and urine. So the postmortem was not impacted, but the collections inside their home actually was impacted. So we had to suspend collections. And they've been suspended since March of 2020, and we're right now in the process of restarting up the biorepository again and doing outreach to go and let patients know that we are ready to go to their homes if they're comfortable with the person who's vaccinated to go ahead and collect their blood and urine. So we're certainly excited to go ahead and launch that. But as everybody across the globe, COVID impacted everybody, whether it's awareness about ALS, raising awareness, that was impacted, and so forth. But regardless, what we do here at the registry did not change. We were still full steam ahead, publishing, getting our results out, and so forth. That was very important. One area to your second question is we are actually in the process of, we contacted the National Death Index here at CDC to request data to see if patients who were exposed to COVID in 2020 had a higher mortality when compared to 2019 and previous years. So those data are currently, we're waiting to go ahead and get the 2020 data, which will be available sometime, I think, in December. Once we have that data, we will be able to see if ALS patients had a higher mortality during the start of the pandemic and through 2020 when compared to previous years, or did ALS patients have the same sort of mortality when compared in 2019 or even 2018. So that's really going to offer us much more information regarding how COVID impacted ALS patients.
Excellent. Sounds like a great project. Okay, I think that's it, Paul. If you have more, if you have further information, for example, what you said about progression rates, type of onset, and genes that then you want to share with me, and you want to send it by email,
absolutely,
I'll be happy to receive that. And I don't know if you have some closing words for our ALS community in Argentina.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to go ahead and present to yourself as well as the Argentinian community. Like I said, I've got a special place in my heart for Argentina. I wish you guys the best in the World Cup coming up and all future World Cups. And so for me, as a scientist, it's great to work with other, scientists, other groups as well, whether it's Argentina or other parts of South America or anywhere in the world. We all want the same thing. We all want to figure out what causes ALS. We want to figure out how to treat ALS, prevent ALS, stop ALS, and cure ALS. That's what every scientist wants, whether it's here at CDC or here in Argentina, and all ALS organizations across the globe. We all want the same thing, to go ahead and figure out what causes disease and have therapeutics which are viable and which are available for patients across the globe. That's very, very important. And so for us to be able to present to your group in Argentina certainly is very, very special. And I thank you for the invitation. And we are always looking to work with you guys in the future and provide information and cross collaborate. And so, but once again, thank you so much. Gracias.
And we want to thank you, Paul, for being available for this presentation, and for taking some part of your very, very valuable time for giving us this presentation for our community, not only in Argentina, but we have the Spanish-speaking community that follows us on our social networks, and they all watch our videos, our teleconferences. So I'm sure it's going to be a success as well.
Great, thank you.
So thank you, Paul, for everything. We will stay in touch. You can totally count on us. Hopefully we can get you on a plane and come back here next year or the next one.
Absolutely.
And we are part of the Alliance, as you know. I myself, I'm part of the board of directors of the Alliance. So whatever you have in mind, you can count on us. Okay, and we will always stay in touch.
Thank you so much, Pablo, and tell Dario I said hello as well. And you guys be safe. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
You too. Be safe, take care, and send our salutations and our big hugs to your family as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
To Kevin,
Thank
of
you,
course.
Pablo.
And to Kevin. Say hi to Kevin.
Definitely. Great. Thank you. You take care.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Take care, you too.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.